The trade clash, America versus China and Trump's high tariffs. Welcome to an insightful exploration of a significant global event, the trade situation between two of the world's most powerful nations, the United States and China. This story will guide you through the complexities of their trade relationship, the introduction of tariffs, and the resulting impact on both countries and the wider world. For a considerable period, the trade partnership between the United States, often referred to as the U.S., and China flourished, with the exchange of goods growing steadily. These two countries boast the largest economies on our planet, engaging in extensive buying and selling of numerous products. This exchange is what we call trade. The volume of trade between the U.S. and China increased substantially over time. However, this seemingly smooth trade dynamic began to encounter challenges. The established ways in which the U.S. and China conducted their trade started to face difficulties. The government of the United States decided that it desired a new set of rules governing this trade. The then President of the U.S., Donald Trump, advocated for a revised strategy known as America First. This principle emphasized prioritizing the interests of businesses and job creation within the United States. One of the primary tools the U.S. government employed to achieve this was the implementation of tariffs. Tariffs are essentially special taxes that countries levy on goods imported from other nations. When a country imposes a tariff on a particular product, the cost of buying that product increases. The U.S. government initiated the imposition of new tariffs on a wide array of goods originating from China. The underlying objective was to encourage American consumers to purchase more domestically produced goods. Additionally, the U.S. aimed to pressure China into modifying some of its existing trade regulations. Predictably, China did not respond favorably to these new taxes. The Chinese government perceived these tariffs as unjust to their businesses and citizens. Consequently, China decided to retaliate. Retaliation in this context means that China responded by imposing its own new tariffs on goods imported from the United States. This back-and-forth imposition of taxes, where one country introduces tariffs and the other responds in kind, is termed retaliation. It signifies a form of economic fighting back, using taxes as the weapon. This disagreement concerning trade and taxes escalated over time. Both the U.S. and China continued to add more tariffs, leading to what some observers described as a trade war. A trade war can create significant hurdles for businesses and can also lead to fluctuations in the prices of everyday consumer goods. This narrative will delve deeper into the origins of this trade discussion, the gradual increase in tariffs, the crucial goods involved, such as metals and computer components, and the U.S. government's justification for these actions in terms of national security. Finally, we will consider the broader implications of this trade dispute for people and businesses in both the U.S. and China, as well as its effects on the global stage, and contemplate potential future developments in the trade relationship between these two pivotal nations. President Trump's America First vision meant that the needs of the United States were to take precedence over those of other countries, especially in the realms of business and trade. The central goal was to bolster American companies, enabling them to increase sales and generate more employment opportunities within the U.S. The government sought to strengthen the American economy through these measures. To realize this vision, the U.S. government resolved to alter the existing trade rules. A major change involved adding new taxes on goods entering the country. These special taxes, as mentioned, are known as tariffs. When companies from other countries shipped their products to the U.S., they were now obligated to pay this additional levy. The expectation was that this would make foreign goods more expensive, thereby incentivizing American consumers to opt for products manufactured in the U.S. Initially, the U.S. implemented a new tax of 10% on a wide range of goods arriving from all countries. The U.S. government argued that the prevailing trade regulations were unfair, asserting that other nations had rules that disadvantaged American companies trying to sell their products abroad. President Trump aimed to secure new trade agreements that would be more advantageous for America, stating that the U.S. had been treated unfairly in international trade for many years, particularly by China, and that this needed to change. Consequently, the U.S. initiated discussions with numerous countries, involving over 75 nations, regarding the formation of new trade agreements. While these negotiations were underway, the U.S. government decided to temporarily halt the imposition of even higher taxes on goods from most of these countries that agreed to engage in talks about new rules. However, the situation with China took a different trajectory. The U.S. government did not suspend the new taxes for China because China did more than just agree to talk, it responded by imposing its own new taxes on American goods. The U.S. government had cautioned countries against such retaliatory actions, and because China did retaliate, it faced a different treatment under the revised American trade rules. This marked the beginning of a more significant trade disagreement between the two major economic powers. As the United States began imposing these new taxes, or tariffs, on goods imported from China, the leaders in China closely monitored these developments. They were not pleased with these new tariffs, viewing them as unfair to Chinese businesses and the Chinese people. China faced a crucial decision on how to respond. Ultimately, China chose to respond firmly. Disagreeing with the U.S. actions, the Chinese government announced its own set of new taxes. These taxes were levied on goods being imported into China from the United States. This act of placing taxes on U.S. goods as a direct response to the U.S. placing taxes on Chinese goods is the very definition of retaliation. It demonstrated China's unwillingness to passively accept the American tariffs. This retaliation served to escalate the trade problems. The situation evolved into a reciprocal exchange of actions. For instance, the U.S. increased its tariffs on Chinese products to 145%, and China swiftly countered by raising its tariffs on American products to 125%. This type of reciprocal action is sometimes referred to as a tit-for-tat move, where each side takes a similar action in response to the other. The tax rates were steadily increasing. The Chinese government articulated its reasons for these actions. A spokesperson stated that the United States had initiated this tariff war. China maintained that its own tariffs were a necessary measure to safeguard China's rights and its business sector. The spokesperson further emphasized the sentiment that nobody ultimately emerges victorious in a trade war. While China expressed its reluctance to engage in a tax-based conflict, it asserted its readiness to defend itself. They considered their retaliation to be a reasonable and just response. The United States government took note of China's retaliation. Because China had answered back with tariffs, the U.S. indicated that its own taxes on Chinese goods could potentially rise even further, mentioning a possible future tariff rate of up to 245% on Chinese imports. This exceptionally high figure underscored the growing seriousness of the disagreement between the world's two largest economies. While the U.S. had temporarily paused new taxes for some other countries engaged in trade talks, this pause did not extend to China due to China's retaliatory measures. This marked the beginning of more severe trade friction, with both nations now employing tariffs against each other, signifying the onset of a trade conflict characterized by escalating taxes. The relationship between the U.S. and China was undergoing a significant transformation. Following China's imposition of taxes on American goods, the United States government decided to take further action. The situation between the two major countries intensified. The U.S. announced the possibility of significantly increasing taxes on goods originating from China, suggesting a potential new tax rate as high as 245%. The U.S. government explained that this consideration was prompted by China's retaliatory actions, China's imposition of new taxes on U.S. goods after the U.S. had initially implemented its own tariffs. The U.S. viewed China's response as retaliation, leading to the conclusion that even higher taxes on Chinese products entering America might be necessary. This strategy was integral to the U.S. president's "America First" trade policy. The government highlighted that numerous other countries, exceeding 75, were engaged in discussions with the U.S. regarding new trade agreements. Because these countries were in talks, the U.S. decided to postpone the implementation of higher taxes on their goods. The extra taxes were put on hold for them. However, the U.S. emphasized that China's situation was different. China had not merely engaged in talks but had actively imposed its own new taxes, thus the pause on higher taxes did not apply to China. China disagreed with the extremely high tax rate mentioned by the U.S. A representative of the Chinese government stated that inquiries about the precise tax number should be directed to the U.S. side. They reiterated China's belief that the U.S. had initiated the trade problems with its initial tariffs. China maintained that its own taxes were essential to protect its country and its businesses, asserting that these actions were fair and just. Furthermore, China echoed the sentiment that no one emerges as a winner in a trade war, stating its reluctance to engage in one but also its preparedness to fight if necessary. The continuous back-and-forth actions resulted in a steady climb of taxes between the U.S. and China, making trade increasingly challenging. The trade dispute between the U.S. and China extends beyond mere financial considerations or tax impositions, it also involves specific goods that these countries produce and trade. Certain goods hold particular significance in this trade conflict. Metals often feature prominently in trade discussions. For instance, steel and aluminum are metals with widespread applications in construction. Countries sometimes apply taxes to these metals when purchasing them from international sources. However, in the U.S.-China trade context, other materials are also of paramount importance. China is a major producer of certain specialized materials that are essential for many countries. These are not everyday commodities but rather materials crucial for the functioning of technology. Examples include gallium, germanium, and antimony. China is a significant global supplier of these materials. Additionally, China exports special metals known as rare earth metals, which are integral to numerous modern technologies, such as phones and computers. China also manufactures powerful magnets using these rare earth metals. Recently, China made a decision to halt the sale of some of these critical materials, temporarily suspending exports of gallium and germanium to the United States. China also stopped selling certain types of rare earth metals and rare earth magnets. This action caused concern among many businesses and governments worldwide. Why are these materials so vital? They are indispensable for the production of high-tech products. Companies that manufacture semiconductors, the essential components of computers, rely on them. The entire electronics manufacturing ecosystem depends on these materials. Without them, producing new phones, computers, and other electronic devices becomes difficult. Furthermore, these materials are crucial for the automotive and aerospace industries, contributing to the enhanced performance of cars and airplanes. Critically, these materials are also essential for a country's national security, being used in the production of military equipment and applications. The companies that supply equipment to the armed forces depend on these materials from China. This dependence raises concerns about national security, particularly during a trade dispute. The U.S. government worries about relying on other countries, especially China, for these vital materials, as this could pose risks. Therefore, these special goods, gallium, germanium, rare earth metals, and others, constitute a significant aspect of the trade problem. China's control over their supply makes the situation more complex. The U.S. is actively exploring strategies to secure these materials without facing disruptions in the future. This situation underscores that trade is not merely about buying and selling finished products but also about access to crucial resources for technological advancement and national safety. The American government began to pay closer attention to national security, carefully examining the origins of essential materials such as metals and minerals used in everyday products. This heightened scrutiny was driven by concerns about national security, which fundamentally means ensuring the safety of the entire country. The government recognized that dependence on other countries for vital materials could pose a risk to America's safety. A primary concern was the reliance on materials from China, especially as trade tensions escalated and China ceased shipments of certain specialized materials to the United States, including metals like gallium and germanium, as well as some types of rare earth materials used to produce strong magnets. The U.S. government became increasingly worried about this situation. Why were these materials so critical? Numerous American companies require them. Car manufacturers use them in electric vehicles, airplane builders in jets, and companies producing computer parts like semiconductors also depend on them. Moreover, the American Army and Navy need these materials for their equipment. Without a reliable supply, it could be challenging for these industries and the military to operate effectively, potentially impacting jobs and the country's defense capabilities. Consequently, the government initiated a special investigation. This investigation thoroughly examined all the important minerals the U.S. imported from other nations, aiming to determine the risks associated with this dependence. The government sought to pinpoint the exact sources of these critical minerals. The government's response was to advocate for increased domestic production within the United States, aligning with the America First initiative. The plan involved establishing more factories in America capable of producing both goods and potentially the necessary materials. The president emphasized that America should not be held hostage by other countries, meaning that no other nation should have the power to disrupt the supply of essential materials, which could harm America. The U.S. aimed to prevent such a scenario. The investigation also scrutinized the entire electronics manufacturing supply chain, including crucial components like computer chips. The overarching goal was for the U.S. to have greater control over its own supply chain, which refers to the path goods take from their production to their final use. The government wanted this path to be secure and dependable, particularly for items vital to national security. Reducing reliance on other nations, especially China, became a key objective. The trade issues are not confined to the relationship between the U.S. and China alone. The U.S. government is also engaged in trade discussions with numerous other countries. Over 75 nations expressed interest in discussing new trade deals with the U.S. While these discussions are ongoing, the U.S. decided to exercise patience, temporarily suspending the imposition of additional taxes on goods from these countries. Thus, for most countries, the new, higher taxes are currently on hold. However, the situation with China stands apart. The U.S. did not suspend the taxes for China because China responded with its own tariffs when the U.S. initially added taxes on Chinese products, an action known as retaliation. The U.S. government asserted that because China retaliated, it must still be subject to the higher taxes, which could reach as high as 245%. The U.S. had cautioned other countries against following China's retaliatory path, suggesting that countries cooperating on new deals would receive different treatment. This significant trade dispute between the U.S. and China has repercussions far beyond their borders. Many people across the globe are concerned. The U.S. and China possess the world's two largest economies, and when these major economies experience trade friction, it can trigger widespread effects. Imagine dropping a stone into water, the small ripples spread outwards. The trade fight operates in a similar manner. Some experts fear that the high taxes will lead to increased prices for consumers in many countries, not just in America or China. There are also concerns that the trade fight could decelerate the growth of the entire global economy. If the U.S. economy, being very large, encounters difficulties such as a recession, it often has a ripple effect on other countries. Trade wars generate uncertainty for businesses worldwide. Companies might become apprehensive about future costs or regulations, potentially leading them to postpone investments in new projects or halt hiring. Many believe that there are no true winners in a trade war. Such conflicts can negatively impact businesses and ordinary people in diverse locations around the world. The trade problems between the United States and China raise questions about what the future holds. The new, higher taxes on goods could lead to significant changes for many individuals and businesses in both countries and potentially globally. One major question revolves around prices. When a country imposes high taxes on goods from another country, those goods often become more expensive to purchase. This implies that people in the U.S. might have to pay more for certain items made in China, potentially increasing the cost of everyday goods in stores, making it more challenging for families to afford their necessities. Some experts are concerned that a broad increase in prices could reduce the amount of money people have left after covering essential expenses. These trade taxes could also have implications for jobs. Some companies in the U.S. might find that sourcing parts or goods from China has become prohibitively expensive. Consequently, they might decide to increase domestic production within the U.S., potentially creating new jobs in America. However, the situation is not straightforward. Other U.S. companies sell goods, such as agricultural products, to China. China has imposed its own taxes on these U.S. goods, making it more difficult for these U.S. companies to sell their products in the Chinese market, which could lead to job losses for some American workers. Similarly, companies in China that sell large quantities of goods to the U.S. might face difficulties due to reduced sales, potentially leading to job losses for some workers in China. Predicting the precise impact on jobs is complex. Many believe that this type of trade conflict is detrimental to all parties involved. They argue that when major economies engage in trade disputes involving taxes, it can harm businesses and individuals in both countries and create problems for other nations as well. Large economies like the US and China are crucial to global trade, and disruptions in their trade relations can affect businesses everywhere. The prevailing sentiment among many is that finding peaceful and cooperative ways to trade is ultimately more beneficial for everyone. The future of trade talks between the US and China remains uncertain. The situation is dynamic, with periods of negotiation interspersed with the imposition of more taxes. The US government seeks changes in some of China's trade practices, while China asserts that it is merely protecting its own interests. Reaching a mutually agreeable solution is proving to be a significant challenge. The next steps will depend on the decisions made by leaders in both countries, whether they will continue the trade fight or discover a new path towards cooperation. Many individuals and businesses are keenly observing these developments.